Hey, thanks for joining. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 30 for this video, and so thank you for joining. And speaks to your heart and speaks to your life in a way that He's speaking to me. And so Genesis chapter 30. Wow, if you seen the format of certain movies where they'll start the movie and it's like they start it and happening and then they get to a certain point and they put this thing up and it says 3 days earlier, right? Or what's the backstory to all of this? And so that's kind of what this is about tonight. So what is the backstory and what goes on here? So first of all, I'm going to tell you the story. And this is the story, of course, of Jacob and Rachel and Leah and Bilhah and then also Zilpah. Zilpah. So anyway, we start out in chapter 30, and I'm gonna really just kind of tell the story rather than reading all the way down through that. Just kind of get the high points of what happens here. So what happens is that it starts off in talking about Rachel, and of course Rachel was at this point she was barren and she couldn't have any children, and so she's frustrated. She's upset. She wants something done about it, and so she is she comes to Jacob and she says, Jacob, listen, you're gonna have to give me some children. I mean, this is not working. I got to have some sons. And Jacob, he responds. He says, look, who am I? I'm not God. I'm not the one that closed up your womb, and I'm not the one that could open it either. And so Rachel resorts to the same thing, of course, as what Sarah did, and that she says, well, I'm going to have some sons one way or another. And so what she does is she says, hey, Jacob, I want to have some sons, but, why don't you go into my handmaid, Bilhah, and why don't you go into her and I'll have some sons through her. And so, of course, Jacob, he obliges and he goes in and Bilhah ended up having two sons. Now, at this point, of course, Leah had already previously had four sons for Jacob. Leah had. And now Rachel has none, but Bilhah has two, which Rachel has had some comfort in that, but still is not from her own womb. And so this is like kind of like a soap opera, So Jacob's and now he has Bilhah to deal with. And what happens next is that Leah, she's having some problems in pregnancy. She can't have any more kids at this point. So she says, well, listen, my sister can't outdo me. So what I'm going to do is have Jacob go into my handmaid, Zilpah, and he does, in which she gives him two more sons. So now he's got 8 sons through 3 different women. This is getting to be a mess. This is and Jacob, he's just trying to make this thing work. He's trying to still to get back home again. And so one part of the story gets on down, and what happens is that one of Leah's sons goes out and he finds some mandrakes in the field when they're harvesting wheat. And mandrakes, evidently, it is something that still exists today and still can be found in Israel in the area, is that it was a fruit. It was kind of the same family as potatoes and some tomatoes and potatoes. And it was a small fruit, and it had several different names. I think one group of people called it the devil's apple, but anyway, it was produced. It was almost a narcotic in a way, and whether Rachel had this in mind that it might help her, become pregnant, it might be a fertility type drug or something, or else it was something that would just help her deal with her pain. she made a deal. She, Leah's son found it. She said, "Hey, Leah, have your son give me some of that." Leah said, "No way, because you already stole my husband. So my son's not going to give you that." And so finally, they work out this deal where uh, Rachel gets some, and in return, Rachel says, "Hey, you get to lay with Jacob now." And so Leah goes out and meets Jacob coming in from the field and says, "Hey, I made this deal, and man, you're mine. And so come and lay with me." And so he does, and then through the course of the next few years, Leah ends up having two more sons and also a daughter. So now at this point, he's got 10 sons and a daughter. And finally, through the end of the verse, finally, God has mercy on Rachel. And what happens is that she conceives and she has Joseph. So now he has 11 sons, 11 of the 12. And so that kind of concludes what happens at this point. And you can see that Jacob now, let's talk about where he's at. He's got basically four wives. Now that's trouble. All right, that's trouble for Jacob. And not only that, he's got this father-in-law that really won't release him, won't let him go back, and so he's dealing with that. And he's been there for at least 14 years now, and more, and yet he couldn't go back. So let's go back to where this started here for just a moment, and let's talk about what happened back over in Genesis chapter 27 and 28. Isaac had sent Jacob away, and here's what he said. He said he sent him away to Padan Aram to take him a wife from thence. You notice what he says: to take a wife. Wasn't he mentioned of going to take some wives? Now Jacob kind of got himself in this. I think this is Jacob is still reaping the fruit of what he sowed. Reaping what he sowed, in that he was a deceiver in a way that he deceived, and he stole Esau's blessing, and so as a result of this, that there's all sorts of things happening to him. And I think he came, he went on his journey back to the homeland. They said, don't take a wife from the locals, but go back to the family. We don't want you to marry into that. But he ends up getting in as almost a big mess, if not bigger than what he could have, or what would have happened if he had married somebody from perhaps from one of the local people there. And so he comes in, he finds Laban and his two daughters, and Laban ends up basically keeping him hostage, working for him, and in return for his two daughters. And of course he really wanted Rachel, and that's all he wanted. And he was deceived by Laban. And so this is all kind of ballooned out. It's just become a bigger and bigger a mess. And that's really a testimony of what happens when we compromise. And I thought about that when we know God sends us on a mission, or God puts in our heart to do something, or we're just living in the life of Christ, but perhaps somewhere along the way that we decide to compromise a little bit. And we say, well, it's just a small thing. And I've always liked the analogy of what something just veering off a little bit in compromise, where it can end up. And what I've talked about before is that we of course live during the age where we have satellite TV, and they're out in space, 25,000 miles out of space. There's geosynchronous orbit where these satellites exist, and it's geosynchronous in that they kind of move at the same speed as what the Earth rotates, and so they always stay over the same part of the country. And with just a little bit of rocket fuel, that they can control these satellites and keep them in orbit. But if you think for just a moment that if you have a radio signal that goes out from the Earth in a certain width, and you're aiming out in space 25,000 miles, it doesn't take, if you have an antenna, it doesn't take but a couple of inches either way, that by the time that that signal reaches that satellite, that it might not be hundreds of miles off. And it just began with a little bit of variance at the beginning point, and that's what compromise does. Is when we have compromise, and that's what Jacob's done. If Jacob had stayed on course, and when he came to find Rachel, if he had, rather than say, well, listen, I'll agree and I'm going to stay here, I'm going to work 7 years, I'm going to do this, all the things that he compromised in doing, he wouldn't be in this predicament that he's in now. And I think that again is a lesson for us, in that although it might be something really small and we feel like we're doing the right thing, if we compromise and we know that what we're doing is really not in line with the will of God and His purpose, it's just like Rachel, is that Rachel was trying to solve her problem by giving her handmaid, by perhaps using something else to bring about her pregnancies. All of that, that is what we do sometimes in a fleshly nature, rather than just depending on God and putting our trust in Him, is trying to resolve it in our way. And the same thing Sarah did with Hagar and Ishmael. It wasn't the child of promise. It wasn't God's intended purpose. And so now Jacob has 4 wives. And I'm going to tell you that God's intention is not for any of us to be polygamous. As a matter of fact, I was going to talk briefly about that. And back in Genesis, in the 2nd chapter, early in Scripture, of course, Adam was given Eve and had one woman to one man to one woman. And it says there in that part of Scripture, in the 2nd chapter of Genesis, verse 24, it says, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined unto his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." And so, obviously he makes no mention about wives. He says to one wife. And again, Paul repeats that over in Ephesians chapter 6, 5 and 6, to where he reminds us that's also a picture of the church. "Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined unto his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." So there is the precedence of that. It's one man for one woman. And as a matter of fact, when we get over in the New Testament period, and of course we've seen this in the Old Testament times, that that there were certainly a number of people, in Jacob being the biggest, one of the most prominent figures of having multiple wives. And let me tell you that I don't know everything about what God's plan is, but I certainly think that what God's desire was him to go and find a wife, and because of his his way of going about that and his compromise, that didn't happen. In New Testament time, really that had pretty much ceased. In the Roman Empire, polygamy was really not a common event. There were aristocrats that had some kings and different people like that. King Herod is recorded by Josephus as having 10 wives, and so there were some in Palestine that did that, but in most of the Roman area, the Roman Empire, there, that just didn't exist. As a matter of fact, monogamy was really prescribed by most societies, and polygamy was not. And or bigamy is marrying more than one person, or being married to another when you're still married. But that really doesn't fit in at all. As a matter of fact, when we read about what Paul wrote to Timothy concerning elders and deacons, again he uses the language there, the husband of one wife. Now there are many that the literal language there is a one woman man, and whether Paul's intention there was to be married only once, or not be in a polygamous relationship, it all really comes down to the same thing, in that anytime that a man had more than one wife, then there became an issue with that, and that was something that really was frowned upon, and still is. God's desire is for us to stay married to one person during our life, and certainly things happen that uh, in people's lives, and we see it to where that doesn't always hold up for whatever reason. But it's still in like Jacob's area, God allowed this, but it wasn't God's perfect plan. And so, as a result, and there were a lot of complications in this, and we see the result of that in how Joseph was treated by his brothers later on and sold into slavery, and perhaps a lot of that had to do with the fact that the brothers were from different mothers, and there was some division among them, and that might not have been there had they been brothers from the same mother. So we can see that God's law concerning things, that whatsoever man sows, so shall he reap. That comes about, and certainly we're aware of that. And so I think for our lesson tonight, our takeaway here is to beware of compromise, is to beware of things of decisions which might bring about these events which begin to grow larger and larger. And listen, he's in a mess now, but it's not over. It's not over. He's got lots more things in front of him, and even for the rest of his life, he's going to see some things go on here. But as you can see right now, this is not looking good. And so there's the backstory to that, is because of Jacob's, because of his deception, and because of his compromise, and where he's gone. At this point, he's kind of in a mess now, and so it's going to be a while before he gets it straightened up. So anyway, we'll pick up with more of the story next week, to where he begins to plan his escape from Laban, his father-in-law, and finally get back to his country, and as we continue. Thank you very much.